So, hi, everybody. I'm Carol Kauffman, the founder of the Institute of Coaching with Margaret Moore and Susan David. And I am here with one of my favorite goddesses, Herminia Ibarra, who is many, many things, teaching at London Business School. She's written a ton of books. The two most recent books are Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader, and Working Identity. Did I get that right? And they are both so popular that they both came out in second editions this week, which is like amazing. I thought that for us as coaches, what might be the most interesting is to hear about act like a leader, think like a leader. And when Herminia asked me to do a little blurb on it, what came to my mind is, we know the phrase, actions speak louder than words. But I think from Herminia's book, it's not just that actions speak louder than words to other people. They also speak louder than words to us, and how we can learn how to act, then think, and then be a leader. So Herminia, do you want to share the kind of overall concept of the book for people who haven't read it or who are just buying it?
Sure. Hi, Carol. It's great to be here. Right. So the idea of the book is about how is it that we step up to bigger leadership roles. And it's a kind of a classic, what got you here won't get you there situation. Typically,
Mhm.
people have been successful because they're a subject matter expert in an area, whether it's functional or technical or whatever it is. And then as they try to have bigger impact, they have to go beyond the bounds of that expertise, and they're not quite sure how. Because increasingly
Mhm.
today, when you're wanting to step up or you're wanting to be promoted, you can't just kind of change and adapt once you've got the new role. You really have to start doing it beforehand. That's how you grow into it. So it starts with the idea that what got you here will get you there. And how do you figure it out? And the way you figure it out is very actively, because typically
Mhm.
what we're trying to change is not a body of knowledge to absorb, but a new way of having impact in the world. And so there's three parts to that I've discovered. The first is called redefine your job. And all that says is that you are what you do repeatedly and habitually. And so if you want to grow a new skill or a new way of doing things, you have to find ways of doing it as part of your day job, even if it means taking on a side project or doing it in some other way. But how can you let your job be a platform for your learning and not just kind of the place in which you execute to the max things that you know how to do already? How to make it be more of a platform for your growth? The second part is extend your network. We grow through our relationships with other people. And, we're busy and we get a little bit lazy when it comes to our networks. And we have the usual suspects that we reach out to and have lunch with and so on. And that means that our world narrows. And so if you want to think about having greater impact, if you want to think about reinventing yourself, you've got to grow that network. And
Mhm.
the third part I call be more playful with yourself. And that has to do with how you show up, what kind of impact you have on people, how you present yourself, a lot about your leadership style. And that's the most personal part. And for a lot of people, this kind of stepping up situation feels to them almost like a violation of their authenticity. It's not me, it's just not me. And
Mm.
so I use the idea of being playful to say, look, you don't have to commit to being somebody that you're not or don't want to be, but why don't you be playful about it and try some things out that deviate from what you habitually do, but for the sake of learning, so that you can learn some.
Mhm.
So that's it. It's a very act your way into a new way of leading kind of argument.
Excellent. Could you follow up and talk a little bit more about strategic networking?
Yeah. So the idea of strategic networking is that we all have all kinds of relationships that come into play that are relevant in terms of our work. And if you try to kind of like parse it out, there's really three different networks. One is your operational network, and those are the relationships you have with people to do the work you have to do day in and day out. People you're on the team with, people you're interdependent with to do the work. And that's your operational network. Then there's a personal network. That's kind of who are you close
Oh,
to and
hold on.
friendly with.
Wait. Austin, we need, I'm going to need to sign off and sign back in. Okay. Meanwhile, you was talking about strategic networking because it's fabulous.
Do I keep going?
Yeah, keep going. They can hear you. I just need to link back in.
Okay. So the second kind of network is your personal network. And your personal network is people who you're friendly with, who you like, who you've become close to over the years. And it could be friends at work, close colleagues, it could be mentors. And that's personal. That's idiosyncratic. That's personal to you. The third network is a strategic network. And the strategic network is about the contacts that could be really relevant for you in terms of your future. Those are the relationships that allow you to maybe go beyond the scope of your job to try to understand how you can add more value, how you can provide a more strategic perspective to your organization. Those are the contacts that allow you to think more strategically about your career. Relationships I don't have just yet, but are key stakeholders for me in terms of I need to have visibility with them. I need their help. I need to be on their radar screen. So that's the strategic network. It's much more future facing and it's discretionary in that nothing happens if you don't have those contacts now, but not having them can get in the way of achieving your future goals.
Yeah, I really love that concept because, what you talked about is also, we tend to, when we think of networking, we tend to think of people we kind of sort of already know or who are in our field. And you were really talking more about external
Who needs to be
networking.
there?
Yeah, and then also sort of having the courage to act in terms of that. And you sort of talk about the degrees of sort of what is it, the 7 degrees of
6 degrees of separation.
separation, and that in your networking to keep thinking of second and third degrees of separation, which if we all would do that, just like a couple of people to experiment, because I love that idea of just try it, act, then see, gee, your identity might be so-and-so wouldn't answer me, but actually they do.
They actually do most of the time that you try.
Yep. And one of the things I really loved about what you've been talking about, you say a whole bunch of stuff, but one of the things you say, sort of this coaching thing to start with the end in mind. And you have a very different perspective on start with the end in mind. Do you want to share that with us?
Yeah. So the people that I work with and write about, they're trying to reinvent their leadership, the kind of impact they have, the style they use to work with people so that they can be more motivating, more persuasive, more impactful. And so starting with the end in mind isn't particularly helpful. It's, I'd like to have more impact, or I'd like to, what does it actually look like? It's much more helpful to start trying some things and ask. So I'll give you an example. So people have, when it comes to leadership, people have this big ought self that's there. I ought to be a better listener. I ought to be less of a control freak and delegate more, right? So that's the rational self. I ought to do this. But the real mindset is, I'll get a better result if I do it myself. or,
Mm-hmm.
or I can listen, but it's a waste of time when we all know what we need to do. And that's really driven by your past experience. So the end in mind doesn't help. What helps is to actually maybe suspend what you habitually do, try something out a little bit different. So in these couple of interactions, I'm going to try hard not to say anything for the first 5 minutes, for example, and see what happens. Once people start to see a glimmer of possibility, oh, this could be actually quite useful, then they work with it a little bit more and they start to get a more nuanced understanding. They start to understand that it's not just about the other person feeling good, that it could be because they're going to learn something useful, but it's their own experience that then drives them towards a more sophisticated way of doing those behaviors, and their goal from those behaviors evolves. And what ultimately happens is a more sophisticated sense of what a more effective way of leading might be.
I love that. So, what are some of the kinds of experiments that you've seen people make? Because in a way, you're saying experiment, act, experiment, and see what happens. And then where you want to go may iterate as a result of that, rather than have this sort of more rigid end state in mind.
So the main thing that I'm saying actually is do not take your job as given. That is, you've got discretion in terms of how you spend your time and what are the activities that you're going to favor and what are the activities that you're not going to favor, and where are you going to spend more time and where are you going to spend less time, and can you carve out a bit of that to, for example, get involved in a project that's outside of your immediate area, or for example, carve out some time so that you can try out your coaching skills and make that feel for you like a legitimate part of your job or your networking. Say, I'm going to, as part of my job, I'm going to dedicate 5% of my time to some networking events because I think it's going to be important for me. And on that basis, then you iterate and you say, gosh, that's really interesting. That's really valuable. I actually want to spend more time on that.
What have you found are like sort of the primary stumbling blocks to really rising? Because one thing I want to say is just one thing you said about how you kind of go up to a new identity, a new way of thinking and being, was you talked about for some leaders, you're supposed to sort of do the things, and then you said, I'm trying to find the exact quote because it was so great. It's sort of, you are not the work, you are the fuel. That is just, I've never heard anybody describe that transition better. Do you want to talk more about what went into that? I'm going to cross stitch that on a pillow.
Well, I wish I could claim it, but I believe I was quoting from the legendary Charlotte Beers, who was CEO of Ogilvy and Mather a very long time ago. And in one of her many different careers, after she stepped down from running Ogilvy, she did a good bit of work coaching women leaders. And what she found was that there's something very similar to what I had seen in this kind of misguided sense of authenticity. As people start to step up, when they start to see that selling your ideas is as important as the ideas themselves, and it doesn't matter as much if you've got the correct analysis, but do other people buy into it? A lot of times people's initial impulse is to say, that's not me. That's playing politics. That's not me. I'm all about the substance. That's all form. And she had this lovely way of talking about it, which is to say, you are much more than the work. Don't kid yourself into thinking that your identity is the work and nothing else. No, you are the way you show up for it. You are what animates it. You are what brings it alive, what gives it meaning. And try to harness and leverage that rather than shying away from it as being about, just the form and not the substance.
Mm-hmm. And as I was thinking about it, but I was picking up from what you wrote is what that also means is my job is to be the fuel for other people to do the work. I think
Yes.
that was
Yes.
I think a very powerful point that you were making. Another thing that I think will be useful for those of us who are coaching leaders is because I've really done a lot of this work myself. And this one thing that you said I found really helpful, which is when you become a newer boss over people, what you say is find the right distance between you and your reports. I thought that was really very good because it's like, oh, you can't be friends or you're always their boss, you're never not. But you found a very nice, much more nuanced way, I think, of talking about that.
I don't recall talking about that, Carol.
That's so funny. It was brilliant, Herminia. See, this is, when people say you've forgotten more than I know or I
Yes,
know.
I don't
Yeah,
recall
you had a great
talking
story in
about
there also about,
that. But
you can't be
certainly
friends.
part yeah.
Oh, sorry. You were talking about authority, how you don't underdo it and overdo it. That's so
Yeah.
funny. You're so brilliant. You forgot what you said. So what's your favorite part of the book? What do you think has had the most impact on people that is rewarding to you?
Oh, it's the chapter on authenticity. It's the chapter
I
on being more
wonder.
playful with your sense of self. I wrote when the book came out first in 2015, the article in the Harvard Business Review that preceded it, which was a piece of the book in shorter form, was called The Authenticity Paradox. And I think
Mhm.
that has had a lot of impact. It's a real favorite of mine because it speaks to my own experience as well. And it really talks to this notion that, when we're moving into unfamiliar waters, that, things that really stretch you outside your comfort zone, particularly stylistically, every bone in your body wants to cry out, no, that's not me. No, I'm not doing that, whether you say it explicitly or not. And what I've tried to argue is that that should actually be a signal to you that you've got something to learn rather than shying away from it. It's still difficult, but when you say that's not me, essentially what you're saying is that's unfamiliar. I don't know what's going to
Mm,
happen. It's a little bit scary, and it evokes a more cautious, a little bit more rigid version of yourself. Not your best self, certainly, but if you call that cautious, I'm not so sure what I'm doing here. Self, the authentic me, you're doing yourself a disservice. And
mm.
so I think that whole thing about how do we define authenticity and how do you do it in a way that doesn't condemn you to being as you always have been, a really interesting
Mhm.
question. We all want to be authentic, but adaptable too. And how you reconcile those is that's where the magic is.
That's right, because you were really talking about how it's a constraint. And so how can you experiment and do things that may not feel authentic until you do them? And then like,
Exactly.
oh, that is me. And one of the concepts you talk about, which I used in a coaching session like 2 hours ago, was identity stretch. That I just thought, I don't know if you wanted to say a little bit about that in the context of authenticity.
Well, it simply is stretching outside the boundaries of who you are today. And it's kind of, people sometimes think, are you talking about fake it till you make it? And I'm really not talking about that in the sense that, in a way, fake it till you make it is easy because if you know exactly what you want to be, here it is, and you're not quite there yet, but you can see it and you can work towards it, that doesn't feel fake. When people feel fake is when they feel like they are caught between this is what it takes to succeed and this is what it takes to be me, and they're different things. And oftentimes they will see the people who are successful exemplars as what they don't want to be. That person
Mm,
is so political, or that person, that consultant is all about the form and there's so little substance there, and I'm all about the substance. And so when you see what you don't want to be, that's not motivating, and so it gets you stuck. And
mhm.
so this idea of
Yeah.
the identity stretch is more, it's more like fake it till you learn it, fake until you figure out how far you want to stretch, because you're not going to figure it out in your head. And sometimes you have to stretch a little bit too far to say, okay, that's not it. Let me pull it back some. But you're not going to be able to calibrate it until you play with it actively.
Because I think one thing that you describe, a real downside of not understanding the identity stretch and acting like a leader, is people mix that up with imposter syndrome. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that. I thought that was a great point.
Yeah, I mean, imposter syndrome is a little bit different. Imposter syndrome is, I'm going to be found out. They're going to realize I'm really not qualified for this. I'm not fit for this job. I don't know what I'm doing. Uh, Authenticity paradox is more, you know, I got to look more confident than I am. I got to network when I'm very uncomfortable about it. I've got to be, you know, getting buy-in from stakeholders when, the facts should speak for themselves. That's
Mhm.
more what I'm talking about. Imposter syndrome's a little bit different. And I have to say, it's a topic that annoys me a lot because everybody's got it. Everybody's got imposter syndrome. And if you have any ounce of conscientiousness in your body, you will have imposter syndrome at some point because, there are times the stakes are high and you feel stretched, and that's it.
Yeah, I was thinking of more of like it's natural to feel lost at times as you're growing, and I was thinking of it at that as you sort of try to be more like move beyond what you're doing now, someone might think, oh, I'm being an imposter, as opposed to no, this is what growing feels like. It feels like being lost,
Exactly.
and how to
Exactly.
be comfortable with being lost. I was
Well,
in Star Trek.
you're not going to be comfortable with it, but you accept it as a sign that you're learning and growing.
Yeah, yeah. I sort of think about Star Trek, like Herminia, you're going, excuse me, what? But it starts out with, to boldly go where no one has gone before, which basically means you're lost. So when any of us go boldly beyond and really act beyond our current thinking, we're lost, and that is like okay, and that's what success feels like.
Yep. Well put.
So, what was there anything in particular that sort of inspired you to write this book? And now you did a lot of research, you talked to a lot of people. I'm just curious, what was like the first couple of dominoes that got you here?
I was asked to create a leadership course when I was teaching at INSEAD for kind of mid-senior level executives, and I called it the leadership transition. And I was teaching people who were in that stepping up situation, and I found it really interesting. And I started to see it was a course that had two modules to it, and in between they were tasked to experiment with different things. And it was just really interesting to see when they came back for the second module how they saw things so very differently. It was much less, I need to be a better listener, to this is what I really want to work on because of my bigger career agenda. And so I found that really interesting, and I wanted to take a more systematic look at it.
Mhm. And have you found sort of gender differences in all this when you've done this work or seen how women manage this versus men manage this? Is there any patterns?
I could talk for a long time on that. It's less gender differences than gendered obstacles
Oh,
uh,
beautiful.
on each of the three main points. And that is, when it comes to redefining your job, I'm often urging people to look at their work more strategically. Oftentimes you do that by taking on some kind of side project, trying to get on a task force, getting on something that gives you that bigger view. It's harder for women to get appointed into these strategic projects, and it's much more likely that they get the shit work. If you look at the book, The No Club, that came out so famously about a year ago, about how women are often asked to do the non-promotable jobs as the side extra credit stuff. And so
Mm.
for women, there's a whole thing about how do you say no to these things and then seek out and say yes to the things that are truly strategic, that will give you visibility with senior people and exposure that you need. In terms of networks, that's where my career started, is looking at some of the gender differences there. And the biggest gender difference is when it comes to more senior management. It depends on the context, but in most organizations still today, the higher echelons and the biggest money-making units are still male dominated. And so that means that if you're a woman, you've got to choose between either somebody like me or somebody who's got power. Whereas for men, somebody like me and has power can be found in one and the same. And that has a lot of repercussions for networks, because it is similarity that draws people to each other. It's the similarity attraction paradigm. And still to this day, that makes for an easier, more immediate connection. So it means that women have to work harder. But because they have to work harder at it, they feel a little bit more inauthentic. I shouldn't have to be so strategic. Relationships shouldn't have to be instrumental. And so that's a little bit challenging. Now, there's also another interesting thing, and I really learned about this from our colleague, Sally Hegelson. She has this wonderful thing that she talks about, which I see all the time, which is women are great at building networks, but they don't leverage them. They don't make use of them. They hesitate to call and say, please, I need your help on this. Or can you give me this bit of information? And so I do talk a lot about that as well. Where does that hesitancy come from, and how do we overcome it? And then on the last one, the stylistic and the being more playful with yourself, when we look at who are these really impactful, big presence leaders, they're often men. And so because we learn by absorbing and observing and absorbing, it's a little bit harder. And so when the models for success don't look like you, or you say, I couldn't do that anyhow, it wouldn't work so well for me, it's harder to figure out how to do it for yourself. Emulation feels fakey, feels inauthentic, feels not right. And doing it the way you'd normally do it doesn't quite work. And so it's a longer learning process. So there's a lot more I could say, but it gets a lot more, because these are identity processes. They are processes of changing your sense of who you are. And context matters a lot. And the context is dramatically different for men and women in the same place.
Absolutely. I was just talking to a lovely woman who's sort of skyrocketing up her organization. And it's interesting because she was talking about kind of the sort of games that, like games mother never taught you, and she goes like, but I feel like I'm being manipulative. And it was interesting because I said, well, is it in the best interest of your organization, what you're doing? Like, yes. But it's so interesting is I don't hear men say that as much. It's again that like, oh, am I not being good by mastering the situation and moving pieces around the chessboard?
Yeah.
So I would love to hear, we only have about 3 more minutes, but do you want to talk a little bit about your own identity change, perhaps when you started teaching at business school? That may not fit into 3 minutes, but
That doesn't fit into 3 minutes, but I think you might know the story. I've told that story endlessly, and, and it is my best story, but it really is about how much I struggled as a kind of pointy-headed academic who was trying to teach about the theory when the students wanted to know, what are the 3 things I have to take away, and how can you help me get my next job? And it's all the advice I had. Just really, it was just not me. It was just not me. And I was told to prance around and be a dog and mark my territory and eat their food and get in their face and put my arms around them and see what they were doing and, all this stuff. And I was like, Christ, how am I going to do that? I don't want to do that. I'm a serious academic. Why do I have to do all that stuff? But at some point when you get desperate enough, you do the improbable. And I started doing all of that with, kind of mixed and immediate results. But in the end, I learned a lot about really what I was there to do and about, possible me's into the future. I got to like teaching more. I got better at it. That motivated me to work on it. And so, and here I am almost 35 years later.
And so guys, Herminia is a powerful teacher. So I don't think you know this, Herminia. Back in around, I think it was 2004 or 5, I may get it wrong, you were teaching at INSEAD. There was a big meeting. And so there she comes out with like this white shirt and these black leather pants. And you clearly had learned because you owned the room without saying or doing anything. You were kind of this very authentic, powerful self. So that was, I don't know if you know, that's the first time I ever saw you. We didn't meet until 10 years later. Um, any last, and by the way, you did a fabulous job, and that was like 2 minutes. So, any last sort of advice for coaches? Just anything that a piece of your book they might look at. Guys, actually should read the whole thing. I think it's incredibly relevant and helpful for us as coaches. But anything, just last thought that pops into your head?
In the chapter about redefining your job, one of the things that I've added that wasn't in the first edition is the whole material about the leader as coach. And it's become so important, the coaching skill set for people, managers, to be able to lead with questions and not only with answers, and to know when to lead with questions and to know when to provide answers, and to really open themselves up to have conversations with people in which they don't know what answer they're going to get, and to open themselves to actually learning something out of the conversations, even if they're the boss. And that's a big transition for people, in which they often feel inauthentic. They feel inauthentic when they're asking questions. When I know the answer to that, why am I standing there saying, and what do you think? And so it's a real transformation for them to really integrate it as part of who they are, to come to see it as valuable and not just a little gimmick to kind of get people on board. And obviously, as coaches, you know so much about that journey, because, even as coaches, it's hard for us to learn not to say what we think and to ask a question. I mean, I know that for myself. And so that might be a part that you find especially interesting, but I hope you'll read the whole book.
Yeah, the book is really good. You're a really great writer. And usually when I read cases, I sort of like, I don't know, they just don't speak to me. Your cases just drew me in. And I just loved reading the stories of like Jacob and all these other people. It really has worked. So our last note is just, I noticed a lovely comment on you from Lisa Strutt, who is in Ireland. And she says, I love the possible selves work.
Okay.
And so really, I think your book of like, act like a leader, think like a leader, expands the possibilities for us. And we can be more of who we possibly were meant to be. So thank you, Herminia. Herminia, how can people find you and be able to buy your book? What's the best way?
So I'm herminiaibarra.com. That's my website. The book can be bought wherever you like to buy your book, so Amazon or anything else. I'm on LinkedIn as Herminia Ibarra, and on Twitter /X at Herminia Ibarra. So I'm pretty easy to find. There's not that many people named Herminia in the world. So, so if you want to find me, you can find me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Herminia.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everybody.